March 15th, 2019. Marcus Denton had saved hundreds of animals in 30 years as a ranger. He'd never had one save him back. The lion emerged from the darkness at 3:47 a.m., 600 pounds of muscle and scars. Marcus was bleeding out from a sniper's bullet, his radio dead 20 miles from help. Simba, the same male he'd freed from barbed wire 6 months earlier, positioned himself between Marcus and the shooter, roared once, a sound that carried across the savannah like thunder. What happened next defied everything wildlife experts thought they knew about predator behavior. The lion didn't just scare off the gunman. He led Marcus to water, stayed guard while he bandaged his wounds, guided him home. But here's what Marcus didn't know yet. Someone had been watching that rescue. Someone who knew exactly why Simba acted like Sarah's ghost made flesh. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months earlier, the wire had been singing. Marcus heard it first, that thin, metallic vibration cutting through the pre-dawn silence like a tuning fork struck against bone. 30 years in the Mara had taught him to read the savannah's language, the difference between wind through acacia thorns and something caught, struggling, dying. His Land Rover's headlights swept across the grassland as he followed the sound. GPS coordinates 1 degree, 29 feet 31 inches, 35 degree 08 feet 44 inches. The numbers burned into his retinas, though he wouldn't understand why until much later. The barbed wire fence shouldn't have been there. Marcus killed the engine, grabbed his bolt cutters and tranquilizer rifle. The struggling had stopped, which meant either freedom or death. In his experience, it was usually death. But not today. Simba lay tangled in a maze of razor wire, each strand cutting deeper with every breath. Blood matted his golden mane black. The massive lion's eyes tracked Marcus's approach, not with the rage he expected, but with something that looked disturbingly like recognition. "Easy, boy." Marcus kept his voice steady, hands visible. "I know it hurts." The lion didn't move, didn't even twitch when Marcus knelt beside him, wire cutters glinting in the flashlight beam. Smart animal. He understood rescue when he saw it. Snip, snip, snip. Each cut released pressure, freed muscle, let blood flow. Marcus worked methodically, the way Sarah had taught him during those early years when she'd still believed conservation could be won with patience instead of bullets. "Everything bleeding can heal, Marcus. You just have to give it time." Her voice echoed in his memory as he freed the last strand from Simba's rear leg. The lion rolled to his feet, massive head swinging toward Marcus. For a heartbeat, predator and prey locked eyes. Then Simba did something impossible. He pressed his forehead against Marcus's shoulder. Briefly, gently, like gratitude made flesh. Before Marcus could process what had happened, the lion limped into the darkness, leaving only bloody paw prints and questions. The fence, Marcus discovered, was fresh. Professional installation, military-grade wire. Someone had built a trap specifically designed for large cats, positioned it with surgical precision along Simba's territory boundary. But why here? This stretch of savannah held nothing valuable. No water source, no pride territory, no tourist routes. Just empty grassland and the GPS coordinates Marcus couldn't shake from his head. 1 degree, 29 feet 31 inches, 35 degree 08 feet 44 inches. Numbers that felt familiar in a way that made his chest tight. He spent the rest of that morning cutting down every strand, rolling the wire into his truck bed like metallic intestines. Evidence, though he wasn't sure of what crime yet. By sunrise, only the bloodstains remained, and the Mara's scavengers would handle those soon enough. Marcus radioed headquarters from the ridge overlooking the site. "Base, this is Ranger 7. Found illegal snare equipment, Sector 9. Wire designed for large predators. Copy that, 7. Any casualties? Negative. Cat got free." What he didn't report was the feeling crawling up his spine like something with too many legs. Someone wanted that lion caught. Someone with resources, planning, patience. Someone who knew Marcus would respond to the distress call. The next 5 months passed quietly. Routine patrols, tourist escorts, poacher interdictions. The kind of steady, predictable work that let him forget about barbed wire conspiracies and lions that showed gratitude. But Simba didn't forget. The big cat started appearing at the edge of Marcus's vision, never threatening, never close enough to photograph, just present. A golden shadow at dusk, tracks around his cabin at dawn, the unmistakable musk of male lion lingering near his patrol routes, following him. Other rangers noticed too. "Your guardian angel's back," Tom and Becky would joke over the radio. "Maybe he thinks you're his mother." Marcus laughed along, but the behavior troubled him. Wild lions didn't imprint on humans. They didn't show up like clockwork every few days, watching from a respectful distance. They didn't act like Sarah used to. She'd had the same habit during their early marriage, appearing wherever he worked, never interfering but always present. Her way of saying, "I'm here if you need me," without words. A silent promise that he was never truly alone. "I'll never leave you alone, Marcus. Not really. Promise me you'll remember that." Sarah's last words, spoken through morphine haze in a Nairobi hospital bed. 3 days after the poacher's bullets found her instead of him. Marcus shook the memory away, focused on his patrol reports. Coincidences were just coincidences. Lions weren't ghosts. And 30 years in the bush had probably scrambled his brain more than he wanted to admit. But deep down, in the part of his mind that still heard Sarah's voice in the wind, he wondered if some promises transcended death. He was still wondering when the sniper's bullet found him 6 months later, and Simba materialized from the darkness like salvation on 4 legs. The bullet had missed his heart by 3 inches and a lifetime of instincts. Marcus lay in the red dust, tasting copper and failure, watching his blood seep into earth that had already drunk too much. The shooter's muzzle flash had come from the acacia grove, professional positioning, military precision, someone who knew how to kill rangers and make it look like a poaching incident gone wrong. His radio crackled with static. Sector 12, 20 kilometers from the nearest backup. He'd chosen this route deliberately, following elephant tracks toward the Talek River where ivory smugglers like to cross during dry season. Alone, as always. Sarah used to say his independence would kill him someday. She'd been right about everything else. Simba emerged from the darkness like a golden ghost, massive paws silent on stone. The lion's amber eyes swept the acacia grove, nostrils flared, reading scents Marcus couldn't detect. No fear in that magnificent frame, only calculation. The hunter evaluating threats. The sniper's second shot never came. Marcus pressed his hand against the wound, feeling warm wetness pulse between his fingers. Lung shot, not immediately fatal if he could reach the medical kit in his truck. 20 yards might as well have been 20 miles with a hole in his chest. "Easy, boy," he whispered, surprised by how much effort speech required. "Just passing through, are you?" Simba's head swiveled toward him, those intelligent eyes reflecting starlight. For a moment, Marcus saw something impossible in that predatory gaze, recognition deeper than instinct. The same expression Sarah wore during her final hospital days, when morphine couldn't quite mask the awareness that she was saying goodbye. The lion padded closer, each step deliberate, close enough that Marcus could smell the musk of his coat, the metallic scent of old blood from healed wounds, battle scars from territorial fights, claw marks across his massive shoulders. A survivor, like Marcus, like Sarah had been, until she wasn't. Simba settled beside him in the dust, 400 pounds of apex predator choosing to guard instead of hunt. His breathing was steady, controlled, patient, as if he'd done this before. "Sarah used to sit with me like this," Marcus murmured, surprised to hear himself speaking. Blood loss made thoughts float loose, memories bleeding through like water through cracked stone. After the nightmares, after the bad calls, never said much, just stayed. The lion's ears twitched, tracking sounds Marcus couldn't hear. Footsteps in dry grass, the metallic click of a rifle bolt. The shooter was moving, relocating for a better angle. Marcus fumbled for his sidearm, but his fingers felt thick and clumsy. The Glock might as well have been welded to its holster. 30 years of training reduced to watching a lion he'd saved from barbed wire return the favor. The irony would have been funny, if it weren't so pathetic. Simba rose smoothly, muscles coiled beneath golden fur. A low rumble built in his chest, not quite a roar, but something that carried across the savannah like a promise of violence. The sound prey animals heard in their final moments. The footsteps stopped. "Good boy," Marcus breathed. "Make the bastard think twice." But even as he spoke, darker thoughts circled like vultures. The sniper had known his patrol route, his timing, his habit of working alone. Someone with access to ranger schedules. Someone who understood Marcus's patterns better than he understood them himself. Someone who'd known exactly where to place that barbed wire 6 months ago. The coordinates floated through his consciousness like fever dreams. 1 degree, 29 feet, 31 inches. 35 degree 0, 8 feet 44 inches. Numbers that felt significant in ways he couldn't quite grasp. Sarah had been good with details, with connections he missed. She'd have solved this puzzle already. Everything's connected, Marcus. Patterns within patterns. You just have to step back far enough to see the whole picture. Her voice seemed to whisper through Simba's protective rumble, through the night wind in the acacias. Memory or hallucination, he couldn't tell anymore. Blood loss was playing tricks with his perception, making dead wives speak through living lions. But the warmth pressed against his side felt real. Simba had returned, settling beside him again like a golden shield. The shooter had retreated, for now. Smart predators knew when to wait for better opportunities. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the lion's steady breathing against his ribs. Sarah had breathed like that during their final night together, each exhale a countdown he hadn't recognized until too late. He'd been planning another patrol, studying poacher reports, choosing duty over presence, always choosing duty. "I should have stayed with her," he whispered to the darkness. "Should have been there when they came." Simba's weight shifted, massive head turning toward the horizon where dawn was beginning to bleed pale light across the Mara. Soon other rangers would start their shifts. Tom and Becky would notice his radio silence, send backup. Professional rescue would arrive with medical kits and explanations. If he lived that long, if the shooter didn't return, if 30 years of accumulated guilt didn't finally drag him down into the red earth beside his wife. The satellite phone rang at dawn. Marcus jerked awake against Simba's flank, the shrill electronic tone cutting through morning birdsong like a blade. His chest screamed protest as he reached for the device clipped to his belt. Military-grade equipment he'd carried for 15 years but never heard ring. Emergency contacts only, command structure, next of kin notifications, dead wife calls. The display showed no number, just a string of encrypted digits that made his blood run colder than the wound already had. Someone with serious resources had this frequency. Someone who knew he was bleeding in Sector 12 with only a lion for company. His thumb hovered over the answer key. 30 years of Ranger protocol screamed warnings. Unknown callers meant ambush coordinates, trap confirmations, cleanup crews dispatching wounded survivors. But curiosity had always been his weakness. Sarah used to say it would kill him someday. Marcus Denton. Silence stretched like a held breath, filled with electronic static and something that might have been suppressed sobbing. Then a voice he'd buried with his wife 3 decades ago whispered through the speaker. "Hello, darling." The phone slipped from nerveless fingers, clattering against stone. Simba's head snapped toward the sound, amber eyes tracking the device like prey. The voice continued emanating from its speaker, impossibly familiar despite the digital distortion. "I know you're there, Marcus. I can hear you breathing. Still that same ragged pattern when you're afraid." He couldn't speak, couldn't think. Blood loss and shock had finally snapped his sanity completely, manufacturing Sarah's voice from grief and guilt and 30 years of accumulated loneliness. Hallucinations were common with severe trauma. His brain was protecting itself by retreating into fantasy. But the voice knew things. "You're wondering if this is real, if I'm real. Remember what I used to tell you about doubt, darling? Trust your instincts over your fears. Your instincts know I'm here." Marcus forced his hand toward the phone, muscles screaming protest. The wound in his chest had reopened, fresh blood soaking through his shirt. Simba pressed closer, offering warmth and something like comfort. "Sarah died," he whispered to the device. "I buried her. I watched them lower the coffin." "You buried someone, Marcus. But you never confirmed who." The words hit like physical blows. He'd been tracking ivory smugglers that night, following intelligence reports about a major shipment moving through the northern corridor. Sarah had wanted him to stay home, claimed she felt watched, followed, threatened. He'd dismissed her fears as paranoia, kissed her goodbye, chosen duty over intuition. 8 hours later, Tom and Becky had radioed the news: armed poachers at the Denton cabin, shots fired, 1 casualty. By the time Marcus reached the scene, everything was smoke and blood, and a body burned too badly for positive identification. DNA testing had been impossible in those days. Dental records damaged by fire. He'd buried what remained because protocol demanded closure, because grief required ritual, because accepting Sarah's death was easier than facing the alternative. The coordinates, the voice continued, electronic and impossible and perfectly familiar. 1 degree 29 feet 31 inches, 35 degree 0 8 feet 44 inches. You remember those numbers, don't you? Where they led you? Marcus closed his eyes, fighting waves of nausea that had nothing to do with blood loss. The coordinates were engraved in his memory like scar tissue, the exact spot where he'd found Simba tangled in barbed wire, the same stretch of savannah where the sniper had been waiting last night, the same grid reference where Sarah had died 30 years ago. They've been planning this for decades, Marcus, using me as bait, keeping me alive as leverage, insurance against the day you might remember too much, ask too many questions. The barbed wire was a test. Would you still risk everything to save something helpless? Would you still choose rescue over caution? This isn't real, he said, but doubt was eating through his certainty like acid. Sarah's dead. I mourned her. I've been mourning her for 30 years. Have you? Or have you been hiding from the truth that you abandoned me when I needed you most? The accusation landed perfectly, striking every guilt he'd carried since that night. He had abandoned her, had chosen duty over family, mission over marriage, the greater good over the woman who'd begged him to stay. Sarah's death was his fault not because he'd failed to protect her, but because he'd never tried. Simba rumbled low in his chest, a sound Marcus felt through his ribs. The lion was watching the acacia grove where the sniper had hidden, muscles coiled for violence. Something was moving in the shadows between trees. They're coming for you now, Sarah's voice whispered. The same people who took me, who've been using me to control you ever since. But this time you have a choice, darling. This time you can stay and fight. The phone went dead, leaving only static and impossible questions. Marcus stared at the device, watching his reflection fragment across its cracked screen. 30 years of assumptions lay shattered around him like glass, cutting deeper than any sniper's bullet. Sarah might be alive. Everything he'd believed was wrong, and the people responsible were walking through the acacias toward him with murder in mind. Fingers stabbed the redial button with desperate precision, but the satellite phone only offered empty static. No electronic handshake, no connection tone, just the hollow buzz of a frequency that had never existed. He tried 3 more times before accepting what his rational mind already knew. Ghost calls didn't leave callback numbers. Hallucination, he muttered, testing the word against his mounting panic. Blood loss, shock, 30 years of guilt finally catching up. But his hands were shaking as he clipped the device back to his belt, and Simba's continued vigilance toward the acacia grove suggested threats more tangible than psychological breakdown. The lion's muscles remained coiled, nostrils flared, reading danger in scents Marcus couldn't detect. The rational explanation felt thin as tissue paper. By the time Tom and Becky's rescue team found him 2 hours later, Marcus had constructed a careful story: sniper fire from unknown poachers, single shooter, fled when backup arrived. He said nothing about impossible phone calls or wives who should have been dust decades ago. Medical evacuation to Nairobi meant 72 hours of IV drips and concerned nurses, plenty of time to convince himself that trauma played tricks with memory. But the coordinates wouldn't leave him alone. 1 degree, 29 feet 31 inches, 35 degree 0, 8 feet 44 inches. He'd never written them down, never looked them up, but the numbers felt burned into his consciousness like a brand. During his second night in the hospital, medicated and alone with his thoughts, Marcus finally pulled out his phone and entered them into a mapping application. The satellite image made his chest tighten. A stretch of unremarkable savanna, marked by a small cairn of stones he'd built himself 30 years ago. Sarah's memorial site, where he'd scattered what remained after the fire. The exact spot where he'd found Simba trapped in barbed wire. The exact coordinates the voice had whispered through encrypted static. Marcus deleted the search history with fingers that wouldn't quite steady. Coincidences happened in the bush. GPS readings could overlap. Memory could play tricks. Grief could manufacture patterns from chaos. There were rational explanations for everything if he looked hard enough. He just wasn't sure he wanted to find them. The medical discharge came with restrictions: desk duty for 6 weeks, mandatory psychological evaluation, no solo patrols until cleared by administration. Marcus signed the paperwork without argument, but privately calculated how long it would take to reach Sector 12 on foot if necessary. Some answers couldn't wait for bureaucratic approval. Tom picked him up in a dusty Land Cruiser, chattering nervously about personnel changes and budget cuts and anything except the obvious questions. They'd worked together for 15 years, shared enough dangerous calls to read each other's moods like weather patterns. Tom's careful avoidance felt deliberate. "You hear from headquarters about the investigation?" Marcus asked as they turned onto the main road. What investigation? The shooting, chain of custody on the scene evidence, ballistics analysis. Tom's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "No investigation, mate. Paperwork says routine poacher encounter. Case closed." Case closed? Someone tried to kill me with military-grade equipment and orders came down from administration. Very clear orders. No follow-up required. The silence that followed lasted 20 kilometers. Marcus watched familiar landscapes scroll past, noting the subtle changes that accumulated during his hospital stay. New fence lines, fresh tire tracks, areas where the grass looked disturbed by recent activity. The Mara was never static, but some alterations felt wrong. "Tom," he said carefully, "the night I was shot, anyone else report unusual activity in Sector 12? Why would they? Radio chatter, gunshots carry for miles out there." Tom's jaw tightened. "Nobody reported anything unusual, Marcus. Quiet night all around." Another lie, delivered with the wooden precision of rehearsed script. Tom had never been good at deception. His tells were obvious to anyone who knew him. The way he avoided eye contact, the slight tremor in his voice, the careful phrasing that skirted direct answers. Someone had gotten to him. Explained what questions not to ask, what details not to remember. The kind of pressure that came with threats implicit enough to bypass official channels. Marcus felt the familiar crawl of paranoia up his spine, the same sensation that had saved his life countless times in hostile territory. But this time the hostility was coming from inside his own organization, from people who'd shared his campfires and watched his back for decades. "You scared, Tom?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Tom's hands shifted on the wheel, knuckles going white again. When he finally spoke, his voice barely rose above the engine noise. "We all are, mate. Question is whether you're smart enough to be scared too." They drove the rest of the way in silence, but Marcus could feel Tom's tension like a physical weight. Whatever was happening had roots deep enough to reach Nairobi, influence broad enough to bury investigations before they started. And somehow, impossibly, it all traced back to a dead woman and a lion who acted like he remembered being saved.